Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer, and this is my son Pringle. It's been a while since I've made a video. I've been very busy these past couple weeks. So a little bit that's new with me is that Pringle has started biting me a whole lot, which is a bummer, but I looked it up and it just seems to be that that's something that birds of this age do, especially Pringle's kind of bird. So Pringle also thinks that he can fly, and he can't. So that's what that was right there. But we're going to just kind of let him walk about. Today I wanted to talk about the movie Climax by Gaspar Noé that I saw recently, because I have very mixed feelings about it, and I think that this is a really good example of a movie that might have benefited from the director working with a stronger writer, because it is a really interesting cinematic experience, and I would say a unique movie, but it doesn't really seem to be about anything. And I think it's important to say that not every story has to be about something deep. There doesn't always have to be this layered, metaphorical underpinning to everything. But some movies that are very abstract and artsy seem to promise you that, you know? And so that was one of my issues with Climax, is that it did seem to promise you that it was this interesting, off-the-wall, maybe deep movie, and then it doesn't really give you anything that's particularly deep or layered. It just seemed to be a sort of style experiment on the director's part. And so if you're not too familiar with the movie, or if you haven't seen it, basically it's about a bunch of dancers that are at a party after one of their dance performances or something, and they are all kind of talking and hanging out, and they're drinking sangria, but somebody put LSD in the punch bowl. So this is, I think, a really interesting premise. I think this is a really good example of the anticipation of action, because after you find out that the punch bowl has been spiked with a psychedelic drug, you're like, all right, something's got to happen. So in that regard, in terms of storytelling, it does give you the anticipation of action, but just the way that he goes about showing you the fallout of this, I found kind of surprising, because I had expected, just based on the trailer and the premise, that we were going to get a lot of psychedelic dance sequences, maybe kind of like in The Big Lebowski when he's at Jackie Treehorn's mansion and you see the dude walking around up and down the staircase with all the dancers and the bowling pin cutouts. That was definitely not what it was. There's not really any break from reality as far as I can tell. They basically take acid and then all freak out. And there is a lot of interesting light play and different colors that's going on. But it's really hard for me to try to extrapolate something from this that is more than, just an experiment in style and interesting direction. And I think that this is something that everybody should consider when they're making something. Because again, a movie or a piece of fiction doesn't have to have this big underlying thing to it. But I think the distinction that I make for myself, and this is just an opinion, is that if you're going to make me invest in something that's long, I want to see a story or some sort of character arc or investigation of somebody's interior for it to be worth it. You know, and even a movie like Dumb and Dumber, which I don't think has a big, deep metaphor behind it, it still seems to have a story to it that justifies its length. Now, the distinction that I'm making is that I think an experiment in style can be very successful and interesting for something that's short. A short story, a short film. I don't know if it necessarily needs to be deep, interesting, long, metaphorical, abstract, but in anything that is sort of long, to me, that's what justifies the length. That's what justifies your investment. If I'm going to sit down for something that's an hour and a half or 2 hours, or read a book that's several hundred pages, I don't want to just see a style experiment, you know? And so, again, that's just my opinion. However, I do think that's something that you should consider as you're writing your stories, if that's something that you want to address in your writing. Is it worth it to just go through many hundreds of pages of a book in something that's only these visceral moments that make you feel these kind of shocking, crazy things, or a very interesting formal investigation of fiction itself, you know? Or likewise with the movie, just to talk more about Climax, is that there's just a lot of horrifying images in it. We just see people freaking out on drugs and writhing around, and people just being really shitty to each other, and it to me, I'm not sure that it ever really gives a payoff for any of those things, other than just this crazy time that all of these people had together. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to give you this deep story, but it's almost as though the movie promises you that, because the opening of the movie is a shot of a television screen where all of these dancers are being interviewed and you're kind of getting to know them. And then after they get to the party, before they're all drinking the acid-spiked sangria, there's a lot of these like long conversations. And this is like a long sequence of the film. This is not just like a short deal. This is like, I would say, close to maybe 10 to 20 minutes of the characters just talking amongst themselves, and we get to know them a little bit more. And then it doesn't really seem to pay that off or to make that worth it. Or like, it's almost as though the movie would have been better and more tonally consistent with itself had it not made you invest in the characters at all. Had they really just gone the abstract route, it's that we've got these dancers, they're taking acid, and they freak out. So that's why I do think that the film fails in a certain respect, because it is so inconsistent in that regard. Because where it's successful is in those visceral moments, the people freaking out, doing these crazy gyrations and dancing on acid. That is the interesting part of the movie. And again, it's successful in that regard, that it is crazy and visceral and gives you these kind of never before seen moments that are truly horrifying by the time that they like climax or peak on acid. But the fact that it makes you invest in these characters at the beginning, but then doesn't really give you any investigation of the information that they put out, is what makes it kind of unsatisfying and inconsistent, like I was saying. And so another thing that I want to talk about is just the idea of having a big, crazy, visceral thing in your story. Because again, this is opinion-based, but I'm going to share my opinions about doing that, and then hopefully you guys can think of just your own perspective on that. Is it worth it, or does it have to be worth it to have a big, crazy moment in something? So, for example, I know probably not as much anymore, but during Quentin Tarantino's early career, it was very controversial that his films were so violent and senselessly violent. That, like, for example, Marvin getting shot in the face in that one scene in Pulp Fiction, totally on accident, is totally gratuitous. And I believe Quentin Tarantino has addressed this by saying it's like, that was the point. He's trying to make a comment about films that are just very gratuitous and senselessly violent, and you're watching it anyway. So I would say for that example in particular, does that make it worth it? If like you're just recapitulating this senseless violence, is that truly really different than just being somebody who shows senseless violence? I don't know. Again, I don't think this is like a moral issue or it's like, oh, we shouldn't do that. But it is something to consider, that are you having this gratuitous moment with a point to it, or is it just a gratuitous, or not, is it just like a crazy visceral thing to shock and awe the audience? Now, to me, I usually want to see it be worth it. Like, I think that some examples of maybe over-the-top, really visceral scenes and things are things like suicide, drug use, self-harm, rape, these things like that. It's like, I don't know if you can put a hard and fast rule that says you should never put these in your stories, but so often when you see these things in fiction or in movies, it doesn't always feel worth it or justified. You know, like, I'm not always convinced that films benefit from doing these things. Now, there are examples of very good stories where these things are justified, you know, but I think especially in like amateur writers or people that are still working on their things, sometimes they'll like have this story and it's like, okay, cool, you've shown the characters, we've got some anticipation of action, you've promised a character change to some extent, and then you just have this like kind of visceral, crazy scene being, it's like, that's real art, that's what it's all about, it's the shot that makes the audience want to turn away. And again, I just don't know if I necessarily care for that. It's not a moral issue, once again, but it's just like, it almost seems like kind of cheap, that the whole point of telling a story is to make the audience feel something, and so rather than like investing in your storytelling tools to make them empathize with the character, you're just showing them this crazy thing that anybody is going to feel something if they see it. I think that this is also something that can apply to like nudity in movies. And again, this is not coming from a moral perspective. It's like we should not have naked people in our films. But I think everybody has seen movies before where some girl will just like take her shirt off, and it's like that was not really necessary. It's just kind of like a cheap way to get people interested in a movie on the basest level, you know? And again, there are plenty of movies where people are naked in the film and it makes sense, but I think especially in like comedies, maybe like comedies of a couple decades ago, it'd just be like, oh, and here are some boobs, and you're like, okay, great, fine, but you see what I'm saying? It's not necessarily interesting to do that, and it does come across as kind of cheap. So all of that discussion is to say that in the movie Climax, there are a lot of those moments that I do question. It's like, is that really worth it? Was that like, did we earn this moment? And so some spoilers here, but again, it's not even much of a story thing so much as like, here are some crazy things that happen in this movie. For example, there's like a pregnant woman who gets like kicked in the stomach really hard. You know, it's like, I guess maybe there's a way to write a story where that's earned, but as I was watching it, I was just like, really? Like, why? That's not what this movie's about. Is this just about, like, it's about these people that are dancing and taking acid. And I guess maybe you could argue that he's trying to make some point about how shitty everybody is to each other, because there are a lot of examples of that in the movie, of characters just being really mean and doing horrible things to each other. Later in the movie, here, I'm going to put a towel over Lawrence real quick, because he is monologuing. Sorry, baby. Yeah, so another thing is that the pregnant woman just like slashes herself with a razor blade several times. And you're just like, okay, and sure, like you can write a story about self-harm where that's like worth it and you need to have a scene where that happens, but like it just kind of comes across as this moment that is prying for a reaction from you, that is like, oh, this is crazy, you know, I'll bet you didn't think that was gonna happen. Whoa, what do you want to look away from the screen now? So you're like, okay, yeah, it's like super crazy, it made me feel something, but at the end of the day, this film does seem to be just a movie full of horrific images that don't really add up to anything, which I guess is fine if that's your view of style. But again, make that a short. Make a short of horrifying moments. Like a 2 hour or 1.5 hour, 2 hour movie of just a bunch of horrifying moments strung together. As a writer, I say not crazy. But again, this movie is worth seeing just because it is so horrifying and there are these crazy things. But I think that you can learn a lot by watching a movie like this to remind you the importance of those storytelling tools that I've been talking about, is that you don't just want to follow these rules just because they're like rules, but when you see people neglecting to follow these rules, you're like, oh, that's why it's important to have dynamic, interesting characters, because if you don't, then you're just like, why are we watching this? What's the point of doing this? Why do we have this? If you don't have this character change, and this can be successful, it's the same question. It's like, yeah, but then what's the point of us investing in this person or in any of the characters in the story? Like, and if it's about them not changing, which plenty of stories do, it still feels worth it because it's about how their circumstances have changed, or it's about how this character is defined by the fact that they are so static and they don't change. And that's like an interesting thing that can resonate on a human level, feeling stuck in a place. But this movie doesn't really give you any of that, and I don't think it attempts to, so on that level it's successful, but it does feel a little cheap and like pornographic. Not pornographic in terms of like sex, but of just like, again, appealing to this base craziness that you'd be like, whoa, that made you feel something, you know? Yeah, it's just kind of, there's just so much in it that is crazy and unique, but I'm not convinced that it really coheres into anything that's truly worth it, you know? So again, I could be completely off the mark on this. I think that there is room for people to argue that especially very artsy movies and artsy stories that is the whole point, is for them to present you something that's like makes you confront your own discomfort at the reality of the world. Because, you know, people do get kicked in the stomach. People do slash themselves with razor blades, you know? And so maybe that would be how somebody would defend this movie, or defend my points, or defend against my points on the crazier aspects of this film, is that it is about confronting these horrifying things. And maybe the psychedelic experience supports that the polite veneer of society has dropped away, and then we see the nasty aspects of ourselves come forward. Again, I usually want to see it a little bit more worth it than that. Another movie that I think does this, and a director in general who does this, is the guy who did Antichrist. Oh, what's his name again? Lars von Trier. Like, if you haven't seen Antichrist, like, the opening shot is like a baby falling out of a window, and it only gets worse from there. You know, and again, it's a crazy movie. I definitely had rapt attention the entire time, but it almost just feels, it's like, God, I just would have so much rather seen a movie with like interesting characters, interesting dialogue, a character change, drama of people affecting each other. But there's just like genital mutilation and horrifying torture and that kind of thing. But hey, maybe that's what like horror is supposed to do, is kind of give you that crazy shit. But I think that's about all that I have to say about Climax for this time, except for maybe the title. I don't know if the title was earned either, because it's like, I thought it was going for this sort of thing like the climax of the dance number, the peak of this psychedelic trip. And again, since there's no theme there to really point to, and there's no like one protagonist who has like a very palpable change throughout, it's difficult for me to even say if like Climax is a good title for this movie, because it's like, it just doesn't really seem to be about a climax in any way more than it is just about people freaking out on acid. So yeah, maybe see Climax, maybe don't. I saw it in theaters, and so that did make it more visceral for me. I do have a feeling if I had just seen this on my laptop or in my living room, I might not have wanted to see the whole thing, but given the fact I paid for a ticket, yeah, I sat through it. And again, it holds your attention. It's super crazy and is like a visceral experience. So I'll just wrap up by saying that I think seeing movies like this is important, because, yeah, it just makes you reassess your own values in storytelling, what you want to do as a storyteller, and yeah, I think it could help you write better stories. Thank you very much, and yeah, I'll make another video again soon. Goodbye. Please like and subscribe, by the way.